Hello and welcome to Marginal Support, where support is anything but marginal. I am your host, Andre Lindy, and today I have the honor of having a person who is recommended to me by another friend. So I thought this is pretty nifty, actually. Nicholas, it's great to have you on here. How should I address you?
It doesn't really matter to me. I actually went by my last name for a lot of high school too, but Nick or Nicholas is fine. I figure we'll save time if we do Nick probably.
It's great to have you on. Can you just tell me a little about yourself? What's your how are you connected to sport?
Sure. I I'm connected to sport. I think in the way a lot of people are, in that it's not necessarily something that they focus on as they're coming through school and thinking about, and then they sort of fall into it almost. Like you realize that a lot of what you did, maybe both in school and in the jobs that you had prior, kind of lent itself towards that. In my case, it was literally I got asked at the startup that a friend of mine at a startup, and he was like, "Hey, you can answer emails, right?" And I was like, "I can do that. I'm very qualified." And it just kind of went from there, and that was really how I got into it. But I would say, anyone who's worked retail, anyone who's worked food service, they're doing a very similar thing to what we do. It's just, in a different facet.
I don't think anyone goes to school and in the university like, my dream is to be in support. I don't think anyone really really says that. But no, similar experience myself. What was it? I graduated university and knew I didn't want to go into journalism, and so then I was just looking for work and just kind of stumbled into it, and then that just lasted for a decade and a half. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's just funny like that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. It reminds me of like the joke of like a for now job can suddenly turn into like a for a long time job. And I think support is one of those industries where that can kind of morph into that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But that was kind of certainly the case for me, is I was like, didn't expect to be doing it as much as I ended up doing it.
What really about support, really, like once you got into it, what really grabbed you? What made you think, I want to do this more and more, right?
Um, Boy, well, I guess it depends on the day. There's some days when I'm like, why am I doing this? But like in terms of what I really like about it is you a lot of the times I think it's a much more complicated job than people give it credit for. And that's what makes it interesting, because especially if you're in a more leadership position, you're going to be looking at it's not just about like taking care of the customer, right? Like that's the most obvious answer, but it's also about like doing data analysis. It's about looking at trends. It's about really helping manage a team, especially in an environment which requires a lot of soft skills and requires you to really be patient, because most people who are coming to support aren't coming to tell you to do a good job. They're not coming to you to tell you that you've done a good job. Rather, they're coming to you with a problem, and they're stressed, and there might not be in the best mood. Um, and I think that's what makes support really interesting, is this impact that you can have on the company just by like giving someone a positive experience versus a negative experience, and looking at what you see and helping then drive what the company's going forward and doing. And also for me personally, making the lives of the people on the front line in support easier. I think that's huge for me as someone who's constantly stressed.
So I mean, you've touched on a couple things there that I think really resonate with a lot of people in the industry. Yeah, we're not marginal. We are an essential role to the company. People don't realize it. The amount of touch points we have, the amount of information that support brings in. I often like to think of support as the lifeblood of the company, right? If you don't have this here, if you don't have support, your company's going to fold quick.
Yeah.
but it is stressful. So I'm curious, what have you done in the past on your teams? You know, it sounds like you've led teams. What have you done in the past to help alleviate that stress for your team? How do you keep your team motivated?
Sure, I think it was a combination of things, right? One of the big ones, so for example, in my last like kind of big management position is we have of course the weekly check-ins, but a big part of that is for me having discussions with the team members and being like, what do you feel is giving you the most grief? Like, what is constantly causing you a problem? Which was especially relevant because that started out in a startup form, so there were going to be all these sorts of things that we might not have thought about, or just things that as we scale become a bigger issue that wasn't may not have been an issue 6 months ago. And having conversations with them and then being able to tangibly go and talk to other people in the company and being like, hey, can we find a solution for this? And if we can, you come back to the team and be like, hey, here's the steps we're taking to address this. Here might be the timeline. And like, I also want to get you guys in touch with these people so you can provide direct feedback because you're ultimately the single biggest touch point person on this. You're going to be the one who's actually using this, and it needs to reflect really, the solution needs to reflect really your complaint. And if it ultimately isn't a feasible thing that we can do, coming back to them and be like, hey, I talked to like XYZ people. This isn't a feasible solution at the time, and here's why. And I think making sure that you kind of demonstrating that you're A, listening, and B, like taking concrete action, and C, even if you can't do something, you're providing a reason why. You're giving an explanation. You're giving some sort of transparency so people don't feel like they're kind of stuffing something in a complaint box and then it goes somewhere that they'll never hear about again, right? And I think that was a big reason to stay motivated, and also just trying to make sure that if things are really going tough, that we're trying to create situations in which we can have that stress relief and we do get those breaks. I really liked, I don't remember the name of the article, but this guy talked about the concept of Slack, not the app, but literally like Slack in a line, right? Say, for example, like in a cable, right? You have Slack like so. And the idea being is that you need that in an organization, because if you are constantly pulling people like this all the time, if you get into a situation where it's going to pull even harder, then it just breaks and things fall apart. And you basically need that slack so you can have kind of people operating with some breaks, and then when things do get tough, you have that room to, pull, and that way things might get a little bit more difficult, but they don't break.
Yeah, that one, you're the first person to use props on the show, so congratulations. Um, but two, I definitely hear you. I mean, that's true for almost anything. If you're constantly pulling on something constantly, and then that's wear on it over time, and then suddenly you don't realize, snap, and boom. I mean, I remember one time it was my first day on a sport job, and a guy came in, and it was his last day, and he was there to tell everyone off. And I was just like, wow, what a first day. And I'm like, I need not to be like that guy. So it definitely, support is super stressful. You brought up a couple other things that I want to dig into a little, is that it sounds like you're a person that enjoys going out and networking with people, trying to find solutions for people. Have you ever built any programs or anything, maybe in a late stage startup, early stage startup, where you had to create programs so people weren't always, stretched tight like that, something that they could look back on and rely on?
Yeah, I guess it's funny that you say networking, because I'm actually really shy and I hate reaching out to people. It's very difficult. So I'm in the networking sense on like LinkedIn, I'm really bad. But in the sense of like networking within the company, I love that. I think it's really important that like we're all on the same team ultimately, and I think recognizing that and being and realizing that like being on good terms with everybody gets you so much further than, making enemies for petty reasons. To answer your question, I'm kind of interested because I majored in humanities, right? So I wouldn't say I can code in a meaningful sense. So I wouldn't call myself a creator per se, but I did. I guess in the sense of the idea and the recognition, like, hey, we're going to have to build something, and let's focus on what that's going to look like. And so, in the sense that I'm not directly creating that, but I am kind of helping manage the genesis of that. I am sort of a creator. To really answer kind of directly that question, because I think I've rambled a little bit, but when I was at, there was a startup I was at, which is like really kind of like one of my big sweeping support experiences, because I showed up as the only person doing support. And the way it was operating when I showed up is essentially you had a feedback box where you could put in your name, you could put in your email address, and you could put in your grievance. And essentially, when you did that, it would go almost to like a plain text feedback server where it was just a list of everything that we'd gotten. And this was fine for like one person, but as we were scaling, I was like, this is obviously never going to, this can't scale in a meaningful way, because if more than one person is doing this, they won't know what the other person has done. They won't know like who's talked to who. It's not centralized. And so that was, I remember as we were scaling, I was like, we have to start planning to replace this, because this won't work as soon as there's more than one person in the equation. And that led to then, okay, what's then our like customer management solution here? Like, are we going to develop this in-house? Are we going to go with a vendor? If we do go with the vendor, what's important here? Do we need do we need chat support at this juncture? Do we need voice support at this juncture? Is email support just fine here? What about kind of data? Like, what's the pricing on agents? All fun questions that all of us, I think, in support have had to deal with when we've had to like look at these sorts of things. And so that was kind of then the building aspect. I guess the other one I would say too is, again, kind of a feature of the startup environment is everything's sort of ramshackle. So we used PayPal and Stripe as our payment vendors, but we didn't have it centralized. So if someone had like a Stripe issue, we'd have to look it up first on Stripe because that handled the majority of our stuff. And then if it wasn't on there, you'd have to then go to PayPal's website and look it up on there. And that was time consuming. That's like, and so we then had to kind of engineer a solution to that. And so we actually did create an in-house support dashboard where you could put in the customer's email and it would give you all the information relevant to like whatever you would need in support. For example, like what's their current, how long have they been a member? What's their current subscription thing? When did they last renew? Any other relevant information that like might help us with support. So yeah, I guess those are the two main things that I really remember kind of building, where I was like, we're going to have to do this either to make our agents' lives easier or just to make our agents' lives even feasible in the grand sense of what we're doing.
Quality of life is definitely important in terms of when you're working, because that workflow you just described sounds, one, not fun, and just like so much context switching when you're going to have to go between different platforms and whatnot. So I mean that's amazing. You really did take something from nothing and you made something into an existence. Processes and stuff like that. I mean that's great. So what we're seeing now these days in AI is that it seems like it's making some of these processes that in the past used to be very tedious and very just time consuming hard. What are your feelings as someone who's gone from nothing to one? You now can see some of these tools in place that would make it easier for people in the future to set up these processes? Or do you think that AI is just not at all helping that at all?
I think saying AI is doing nothing kind of, based on what I've heard and talked to other people, right? I don't think it's fair for me to say that it's doing nothing. I think, and I think this goes beyond support. I think the idea, though, that it like solves everything isn't necessarily going to be the case. I think the way, and I guess like when you say like AI making things easier, are you talking about sort of vibe coding, or are you talking about sort of cognitive offloading?
You know, right now I'm talking about more when you're trying to create processes, when you're trying to automate things. So in the past, you had to maybe log into Stripe, like I said, you had to log into PayPal, but then you had this dashboard. But now you can go to Lovable, you can go to these other places and just type in plain English. I want to create an integration that
Mm-hmm.
will tie this service to my service and then, create me a dashboard. I mean, right now we're having tools that it's making it so pretty much anyone can create these, particularly these apps or these functions that in the past we had to wait on someone in engineering to create for us. So do you think that now that support and pretty much people in general have access to tools, do you think that's going to make it easier to put processes in place? Or do you think it's still going to be difficult because people might not fully know what they want?
That's a really good question. I don't think it's necessarily like a matter of do like you don't necessarily know what you want. The way I look at it is with AI is this: is it will make some things easier and it'll change the way you work, but that doesn't mean that there won't be work. Right? You look at the history of technological developments, like you look at the computer, the fax machine, the printing press. I'll stick with more 20th century stuff because that's going to be more relatable. But that changes like what people did, like email versus having to fax versus having to just mail somebody something. Absolutely changes things and it makes things faster, but it doesn't mean that you then have less work overall. It's just that what the work you're doing changes. I guess for making integrations, um, I think that that does make things easier. Um, I am very curious going forward now, though, is what we're, at least my feeling has been you look at the financials of like a lot of these big AI companies and sort of the integrations and the promises of what they're giving. Um, and there's still like a road to the investors are kind of eventually going to be looking for a return. And the one thing I sometimes wonder about is we see like how easy AI can make things, but if that becomes more expensive, do we then feel like what it is giving us is still worth it? Especially like in the context of a startup, where it might make things easier, but is that cost then going to be justifiable? Similarly, like when you make stuff, I would still I one of the things I had to help handle at my company was what was it like going through the IT and basically saying like, hey, is this actually safe for us to use? Like if we want to start using this program, how does this interact with our data? Um, what does it do with our data? Who's seeing this data? Like where does it go? What's it processed through? And other things like a SOC 2 test, I believe is what it's called. And that's something that also, presumably, if you're doing your due diligence, it's fine. But like in a startup environment where people are more concerned about like, what is it, move fast, break things. Um, I could see AI letting you break things really fast in that context. I guess that's my thought on it. Is I feel like you should always make sure that you understand what it's doing and what it can affect before you really ultimately like push the button on it. And that goes with any sort of part of the process, whether it's you're making it and it's easier to make it versus you're integrating it into an existing one. Sorry, that was also very rambly. I'm a rambler.
No, that's good. I mean, I think, it's one of those definite genie in a bottle type things where in the past, if you created something and it started to go haywire, maybe it's easy to pull the plug. But, with the way the internet works and the way AI works is that once you put the information out there, good luck clawing that back. I mean, that's not coming back. So, I mean, I think data vigilance is definitely something that people have to pay a lot more attention. I remember hearing a story of a person who put an entire confidential report in one of these Gen AIs to have it do, an analytics, not knowing that once you do that, that is cataloged and it's available to anyone, and then all their competitors were then available to look at that. So I mean, in terms of, you really have to understand what you're putting there, who's going to be the audience, how to look, and so I think definitely, roles like you're talking about, where is this right for our stack? Is this right for our company? How will this be used? Are questions that maybe people don't always think about when they're interacting with these softwares. Next question for you then is, when you're looking at your next thing you want to build or your next place you want to be, how are you going to try to educate people on some of these perils when they start to ask you these questions?
I think a good way is kind of like discussing the consequence and like, if this happens, what does the cleanup for us look like? Like, what does us fixing this look like? And if we can't fix it, like, what are the long-term ramifications, right? Because you have things like, just even going beyond like the product isn't working. There are so many things that a company can do that can break trust and influence kind of what support has to deal with. It's like how I obviously don't know like the full numbers, but there's the whole Anthropic versus ChatGPT kind of kerfluffle we're seeing in the media, right? Where Anthropic didn't feel that they were going to have their safeguards, couldn't use their safeguards in a contract with the U.S. government, and ChatGPT kind of swoops in, and you see people then purportedly claiming, again, I don't know the raw numbers, I think it's like we're seeing installs, but like how much ChatGPT is losing in terms of business, I can't say. But it is affecting their public visibility. It's affecting kind of that image. And that's what, when you make mistakes like that, sometimes that image has long-term ramifications. I think one that I always really like to bring up is Comcast, where Comcast was notorious for their support and its perceived lack of ability to help you. And I remember like when I was looking for an ISP when I moved, I tried to avoid them because I was like, it was like the reputation was such that I was like, I know that if I'm going to have a problem, I don't want to deal with this. It's the same thing with, I think 24-hour fitness, where gym memberships, long running joke that they're hard to cancel, right? But 24-hour fitness was like even more notorious for how difficult they made that process. And obviously that's kind of like a process issue, and that's generally related to attempts at retention, and that's a bit of a different thing. But that is kind of in brief to illustrate like when we make mistakes like this, when we like play fast and loose with systems and processes and data, people pick up on that. Like people know, and it also then reflects to them what your company values are, and that can then affect how they engage with your company going forward. I think that's like a really good, like in a broad sense, right? And then as I said earlier, hey, what does this look like if it goes wrong, and what do we all have to do, and what's like, how much money do we lose just in terms of like fixing this, or like moving platforms, or just like hiring someone to be like, hey, you guys screwed up. And that's maybe the more micro that I would kind of illustrate. I think to sum that up, the best way is always to show someone how much work they're going to have to do if this doesn't go right.
I completely agree with that. I mean, it's like, if you make this choice, the saying all PR, like not bad PR is even good PR, no. Once people start voting with their dollars, that's not good PR right there. And I think you definitely are seeing that a little bit with OpenAI. I mean, look at the fact that Claude basically crashed because people were overloading it. Just shows you just how strong people can vote and how strong sentiment can change.
Suffering from success.
Which is, I mean, honestly surprising that you think, okay, your whole thing is that we can handle so many prompts, so many questions, and then that they got overloaded is honestly amazing, but also scary at the same time. This, so many people could overload a system like that. I want to go back to something you just said, though. It's how people interact with public can change perception. Think about how dangerous someone can be in support if they're a jaded or bitter person, right? And they start getting tickets and they start just being a complete, mess. They start just giving wrong answers and whatnot. What steps would you take if you found out that one of your team members was intentionally being a bad actor, right? I mean, I've never experienced, but I think it's kind of a nightmare experience for people in sport if someone does start to do that. What would be your reaction if something like that happened to you?
I think the first thing, the first thing I immediately want to do is like talk to them, right? Get information, um, because I've had bad days. I ironically would call myself kind of a jaded and cynical person, but that can't affect the tickets, and and in some ways that can kind of be an asset when communicating with team members, because you can be like, yes, this job is really hard, and I'm not going to pretend that this is sunshine and roses, and I don't like getting yelled at. I hate having someone just like rip me a new one for something that's frankly not even my fault. Like, and it's something I might have even talked to engineering and been like, I'm gonna get tickets about this if you do this. Please don't do this. And then they did it anyway, and here I am. Um, but I think the first thing would be talking. It would obviously also kind of depend on. Ideally, we have QA systems in place where this is noticed quickly. This isn't like a thing that we find out 3 months down the line that we've essentially had like a double agent. But like a conversation first, and then basically, I think that kind of would determine how I was going to go forward with that. Because if it's something where I don't feel like this person is taking it seriously, then it's sort of like I'm not going to put effort into trying to rectify this. Then and like this is just over, right? And like this stinks and I hate doing this, but I can't hire someone who's. It's no one thing if you're like not even trying, but you're actively trying to make things worse for everybody, and it's like I have a limited budget and I can spend this on something else, And it's like if you don't want to work with me, then I'm not going to work with you. Um, and then assuming this person hypothetically like shows contrition and wants to change, I would definitely be like giving them they'd be watched pretty hard, but I'd want to. It would be one of those things where like they're going to be on thin ice for a long time, even if they stay, because it's. And I like as I talk about it more, I'm like, frankly, like, do I even want this person to stay if they're like doing this too? It's like I'd still want to have a conversation, but I sort of feel like at that point, if you've decided to burn bridges, then I don't know if I owe you any grace. But conversation to start, and then, you know, if they're gone, they're gone. I guess is how I feel about it.
He gone. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's one of those things where it's not even like I'm not upset. I'm just disappointed. No, it's like no, I am upset. You've been intentionally doing something wrong to this company. So there's the door. Bridges burn behind you. Don't ask for a reference. Goodbye. It's
Yeah.
one of those things. Um, so we're talking a lot about dealing with support people, the process we put in place. You've built stuff from the ground up. One of my questions is someone who has built something from the ground up. Now, when you look back on that process, and if you were given that opportunity again, what have your learnings taught you? What would you say? Okay, I knew this didn't work the first time I did it, so this time around, I'm going to switch and do this, because it sounds like you have a good amount of experience in terms of looking back and evaluating what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest mistakes I think I made was I didn't verify enough, and this is in the context of trust, but verify. And I think people can earn trust, but that doesn't mean you then. I think I should have been really making sure I'm independently verifying things more. I think also, because I maintained some relationships with people at companies like after I left, and kind of like having discussions with them post facto, where it's more like there's not that they're not like you're my boss and I feel like I have to couch things to what I say to you anymore. That was actually really kind of eye opening to me, and getting that sort of like, oh, like you felt like this, but you didn't feel comfortable kind of sharing that. I would kind of want to make sure that, like, for example, I don't want the perception that I'm playing favorites, because it's not something that I ever want to do, and it wasn't something that I think I wasn't consciously trying to do. But like someone said that they did have the impression that there were certain people who I like viewed as like my golden person, and I'm like, I don't like that. Like that's actually a huge problem, because then it means if that person's doing something wrong, it means you're not comfortable sharing that with me, and that means that now I like we essentially have, you know, a ticking time bomb. So that's one thing, kind of trusting, but you really need to verify, and you really need to create an environment where no one person is viewed as invincible. I think another thing would be pushing back. And what I mean by this is like when you're building these systems, you're going to get requests from other people as to like how they think it should look and what they think it should do. And that can lead to bloat in these processes that you're building, and it can lead to processes that never needed to be there in the first place. And you're spending money on tech and people for that, and it's not adding any value. And I think you really need to make sure when you're building these sorts of things and you have these kind of discussions that you look at the want to haves versus need to haves, and you make sure that you look at the data and being like, if we add phone support, like, are we seeing demand for this? Is this something that like we do think people are going to use? And if we want to try to do this, should we run like a test program and basically see even if this does do anything? And that's, I think, a really, that one is to me, I was at a company once where there was an executive who had originally listed his phone number as the support number, and this was when they were like 3 people at the startup. So obviously this is still kind of public knowledge, and so as we're expanding, then when things go down, all of a sudden he gets like 500 calls because, you know, we were having a Cloudflare problem. And that was like the genesis for our adding phone support, is to just kind of create like a diversionary number. And in retrospect, I wish I would have just been like, why don't you just change your number? Because like then we're not hiring people. I don't have to spend all this extra money on these systems and processes. Like I don't like, and you're not getting called anymore. And I get that this is like a minor hiccup for you, but now this is not all a bunch of budget line items that we have to deal with every year. And I think that's a really big thing. Is like make sure when you're building a process that you recognize that you don't actually need to do something. It doesn't actually make sense to do this. And you know, backing that up with data, or just demonstrating it however you can, will do you so many favors. Because then you're not stuck managing a kind of moribund aspect of your support department for 2 years.
I mean, it's interesting because, you know, everything you said there seems like it all tied back to the first thing you said was independently verify, right? Does any of this actually need to be done? And I can definitely relate with the bloat section, is that if you're creating the process and you have it well defined, you know exactly what it should do, what you need to do. But then when you get little voices coming in, because they think, oh, you know, maybe this would be great. No, they don't really know the process. You know the process. And so that's, I think, you know, being a champion for that process, but also being a defender for that process is also very important.
Yeah, I think I tie that really to my own experience, and because it was essentially the first time I've been in charge of anything. And so like, I think when you are the first time in charge of anything, you're just nervous, and you don't necessarily trust yourself. And sometimes you have to realize that you are the SME, you are the subject matter expert, and you need to demonstrate that.
Good. We are starting to come up at the end of our time, so I'm going to close this out with one last question. Um, for people that have never been in support or thinking about support, it's a changing landscape right now where we're probably going to see a lot of traditional tier one roles go away simply because you have AI automation that can, handle a lot of these frontline tickets. There's a lot of things that can search resources for you. What would you say someone should do nowadays if they want to try to, possibly get into support? Because it's a changing field and it's a rapidly different field. How would you say people should probably change their mindset if they think they want to even try this line of work?
Um, I don't know. It's like be interested to see who's even interested in trying this line of work on like a lark. But I think the big thing for me, and this is something I'm really struggling with right now, is that um, not a lot of people. I think a lot of people are saying they know is going to happen, and I don't think. I think the reality is most people are still kind of figuring out what that looks like next. But if you are interested in going into support, the thing I would always look at, and I guess it depends too. Like if you're trying to go into a tier one role, I think there's still gonna be those. Especially like AI doesn't understand nuance yet. You can find that, but like in a more leadership role, when you're looking at things like AI and like what you think it can eliminate, you really need to be looking at like what's the long-term ramifications of this. Like if I'm trying to build a support team that has like a long-term coherence in the sense that I'm developing people, and if people like get promoted up from within, or if someone at a higher position leaves, I can then grab someone maybe from a lower position and move them up, which is kind of a people management thing, a bit of a separate conversation. What When you add these processes and say you eliminate these tier one roles, what then does that look like going forward? Like, what does that look like 3 years from now when you have a lower thing? What does that look like if you suddenly have an outage and your AI isn't performing as well because people are demanding answers, and an AI is really good for kind of base level things, but it's not good for really complicated problems. And it's being all escalated to the lower amount of people that you all have. Um, and you should be thinking about those questions. You should really be thinking about like, what does this, when I'm using AI, what does this look like in my team? What does this look like in my processes and systems? I'm using AI because that's the number one, question in everybody's mind. It's the thing. And also, how do I talk to executives? There was a really good talk at the Elevate CX conference by a person whose name I am forgetting, which is very embarrassing. But they talked about one of the skills that you need to have is you need to know how to talk to leadership, and you need to know how to demonstrate the value of support to leadership. And it's going to be more important to do that now than ever, because I think all of us who have worked in support have had that experience where people just view this as sort of a whatever job, right? They kind of view it almost in the same way as like, oh, it's just like you're a barista, like you make coffee. How hard is it really? And being a barista is really hard, actually, because it's customer service on top of you have a very like time frame specific type of thing you're supposed to do. And support is hard too, and you're going to need to show why it's important. And you and I know this, but the person who has never worked in it before or has never really thought about it before might not. And I think that's what they should. That's what you should be thinking about, I guess, if you're going into support. It's not just how do I stay patient, but how do I show people that I matter.
That is, I think, a really great way to end the show on because, I mean, we do matter. Um, so, one thing that I like to say when I end the shows, and I think this might resonate with you, is that I always say that support isn't a job, it's also a mindset. Because the skills that we use and the skills that we learn in support, we can transition to for so many other things. Nick, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yeah, I was glad to be here.
Let's stay in contact. And then for everyone, have a good one. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.
Yeah. See you, folks.